After years of speculation, rumors, poorly match-made teams, viral posts, and experiments, Respawn finally broke the silence on skill-based matchmaking with this blog post, going into great detail on how their current system works and how they're going to change it. And they also may have made a slip-up and told us how exactly we can cheat the matchmaking. I already did cover this when the news broke, but there is a lot of information, so I wanted to get my thoughts out in a more condensed manner, and whatever way to do that than with a good old video essay. Before we go into what was said in the actual blog post by Sammy Duke and the matchmaking team, I'd like to introduce two very important experiments of the solo queue experience, which was way before the blog post was released. These experiments serve as an important piece of context for later. The first experiment was performed by Ottr, who played solo queue pubs for 500 games to figure out exactly how it works. In this experiment, where he won 57 out of those 500 games, through his data, Ottr concluded that SBMM seems to give you a winning streak if you do poorly. After 37 bad games in a row, his games were followed up by 21 games where he either won or finished in the top 5. SBMM seems to punish you if you're on a winning streak, as after a solid 15-game streak, Ottr was put up against and lost against some pretty stacked full kill grinder free stacks. Because of his skill level and the nature of skill-based matchmaking, he probably would never be put into a game where he would be carried. The second set of experiments, inspired by Otr's posts, had the user Eccentric Jabaroni track his kill-death ratio for 300 days. And what he found corroborated with Otr's experiments, but also added some new vital information to the theory about the SBMM behind the curtain. Through tracking his KDR, Eccentric Jabaroni concluded the following. In his eyes, SBMM seems to optimize for a top 5 placement. Throughout his growth as a player, going from 0.4 to 2.0 kill-death ratio, his top 5 rate stayed at a constant 25%. What is oftentimes called Big Brother matchmaking, where you're queued up with very low level players and are expected to carry, or I guess act as the Big Brother, kicks in after you hit a kill-death ratio of 2 to balance your entire team to the lobby skill level. The first 5 to 7 days of every season is when you are the most likely to have your highest KDR of the season, and he suspected that they reset SBMM every season. These findings, along with the anecdotal experience from countless of solo queuing players, made many assume that something shady was afoot. And lo and behold, there was a research paper by EA about this specific thing, dating all the way back to 2017, where they coined the term engagement optimized matchmaking, where they found that a player is more likely to quit their gaming session if they keep losing, or even if they keep winning. With a sample size of 3 games, the lowest risk of the player turning the game off was if they lost or had a draw twice and then won the third game. Now, I've quoted this research paper so many times throughout the years that I'll obviously have to follow up with this tweet from a developer claiming that no, they're not using engagement optimized matchmaking. But it certainly sounds awfully close, doesn't it? But that's enough for the context, let's move into the actual news. Because leading up to the release of the blog posts, Sammy had shared his thoughts and explained some decision making that goes behind creating a matchmaking system. But what really mattered was this post itself, which Sammy and Respawn shared on the 17th of January this year, so a few months later. And oh boy, this thing gets complicated fast. As I mentioned, I'll keep things as simple as possible, give you some nice examples, and hopefully we can break it down to make some sense. Now, just like with my video, Sammy starts the blog post by establishing context. This data might seem a bit boring, but just like with my examples, establishing the mean is important for what comes later, so bear with us. Just like in his Twitter thread, Sammy explains Apex's progression system. In this part, he explains that a good progression system, such as account level, ranks, or cool badges, will keep a player feeling rewarded, happy, and engaged. But he also adds that most progression systems will have an impact on a player behavior, and it will change how matches play out. He directly quotes the example where a public match player might drop hot in Fragment for the fun and the adrenaline without a care in the world, but when their points are on the line in a ranked game, they might play very passive, on the edge, and avoid fighting not to lose their hard-earned ranked points. On the flip side, daily or weekly challenges might make players choose to play with different weapons, legends, or even go to different points of interest than usual, which also impacts their performance in-game. These progression systems, specifically things like account level, rank, and badges, are important as they affect the perception of how fair a match is, but that's not always the case. Some players can be very low level and insanely skilled, as it might be naturally talented or just smurfing, and many players might be over level 500 and still not manage to hit the broadside of a barn. This graph shows the skill level on the vertical, so that's the y-axis, and the account level on the x, the horizontal axis. Notice how there's very little change between the hundreds of levels, yet there are a lot of hours of playtime in between every bracket. On top of that, there are many outliers, forcing Sammy to display the median rather than the average skill level, indicating that account level is far from a perfect representation of one's skill. So let's take a look at how Apex calculates skill rating. As I mentioned previously, skill rating does not correlate with a progression system, such as your rank or your level, and it might not come as a surprise to you that just because somebody is a Predator player, that doesn't necessarily mean they're a higher skill than a Diamond, at least in the eye of the matchmaker. But what is skill rating? Skill rating is a numerical value with a lot of parameters that us, the outsiders, aren't told about to avoid it from being manipulated. To set the example, Sammy gives us a rating scale between 1 being the worst and 10 being the best, so obviously a 6 would be better than a 5. Sammy goes on to explain how to distribute skill through continuous Gaussian distribution, but he adds that this method only works when the algorithm can precisely calculate the skill of a player. As such, they're using another method of matching their players and their games. And that's called the method of discrete buckets, which is the actual matchmaking that Apex is currently using. Probably because it's near impossible to gauge the precise level of a player's skill in something as random and chaotic as a battle royale with 60 players per game. Different skill ratings will form their respective buckets and be matched up against and with one another. For example, if there are 5 different skill buckets, one bucket would consist of 1s and 2s, the other 3s and 4s, the next 5 and 6s, and so on. Sammy explains that Apex Legends currently uses this approach, and with only 4 buckets, meaning that the matchmaker is pretty relaxed. You, dear viewer, might have some ideas of what's going on already, but we're still just establishing the mean. But now, we've gone over all the important bits, so let's pop open that hood and take a look at the matching. How does the matchmaker put 60 players together? Let's assume all 60 players are solo queuing, not being in a pre-made stack, or no filling. To explain this, Sammy gave us this graph of 9 different players, and he even clarifies that this example is a gross oversimplification to explain the point, not factoring things such as ping, queue time, stacks, and other variables to skill rating, but this will give us a good idea of how squads are put together. To build on what we mentioned previously, these 9 players are all pulled from the same skill bucket. When the matchmaker builds squads for public, non-ranked lobbies, they take the approach of matching every team as balanced as possible. This means that if they aim to make the average skill rating of every squad in the game around a 5, they will have to put the best player with some of the worst players, so a 9 with a 4 and a 3, to have the team average of 5. If you are a more mediocre player, let's say a 5, you'll have a teammate that's very strong, such as an 8, and another teammate who's a little bit weaker at a 2. And if you're the worst player in the lobby, say a 1, you'll be matched with either something like a 7, 8, or 9, or 2 medium highly skilled teammates. The consequence is that players with high skill rating will be placed in a position to carry. And this goes hand in hand with eccentric Jabroni's findings, where as soon as he got over a 2.0 kill death ratio, he would start carrying lower level teammates in what some refer to as Big Brother matchmaking. This, combined with the skill bucket approach, should mean that the teams are generally balanced and feel fair. They do feel fair when you look at them from an outside approach, but due to how few buckets there are and how lax they are, a 1 can be up level 10 and a 9 can be an Apex Predator, but we will get to that point later. On the flip side, when it comes to matchmaking teams in the ranked lobbies, they take a vastly different approach. Sammy explains that in pubs, Respawn want to take the approach of making every match as fair as possible, but this doesn't apply in ranked. So instead of building teams so their average skill would add up to about a 5, they remove the so-called burden of carry, or as you might know it, the Big Brother matchmaking, and instead try to make every team as close in skill as possible. This means that in your skill bucket, if you're a 9, you're probably going to be matched with the 8s or the 7s from the lobby. And if you're a 1, the worst player in the lobby, you'll be matched with 2s and 3s. The consequence here is that good solo players don't have to carry worse teammates, but good players are rewarded with good teammates simply for being more skilled. And worse players are going to be punished with worse teammates for being lower in that same skill bucket. To really drive that point home, in pubs the matchmaker wants the average team's skill level to be a 5 out of 10, but in ranked, it builds teams with an average skill level of 2 to be up against the average skill level of 8. This example makes perfect sense in a perfect scenario, but bear with me because once you throw pre-made stacks into the equation, things start to get a bit more complicated. I'll try to simplify it as well as I can. Let's imagine the same rating system in the example that we use for solo players. If a squad with the players rated at 2, 6, and 7 join a lobby, how is the matchmaker going to tackle this? there are 4 different ways they can go about this. They can go by the rating of the lowest rated player, but this means easy lobbies for the better ones of the team. They can go by the rating of the highest rated player, but this means harder lobbies for the worst players. They can go by the average rating of the entire squad, but then you'll still find examples where the top player is better than the squad's average and can still dominate. For example, if a 9 squads up with 2 players with a rating of 1, the average skill rating would be 4, and it can go by a weighted average, which would take the more skilled players in consideration, by making them heavier when matchmaking the team, which would make sense, but there's no accurate way to calculate the weight across every skill level. At the moment, Apex Legends found that the best solution is going for the second option, which is going by the highest rated player, both in pubs and ranked matches. This offers protection from matchmaking exploits with new players and smurfs, but comes at a cost of the lower rated players having a hard time keeping up with the highest players' lobbies. Sammy adds that when the matchmaker builds these games, it will always prioritize putting premade squads up against each other first and foremost, followed by duos, and finally filling out the rest with solos. And this is one thing that makes being in a premade squad a massive advantage. And the thing about being in a stack is it's not quantifiable by the matchmaker. You could be playing together for the first time, or you could be a professional team with hundreds or thousands of hours together honing your strategies. Your individual skills might be the same on paper, but your synergy compared to another stack of the same skill rating will beat them every time. But the problem here is that the matchmaker doesn't seem to give it enough time, and due to the lack of players in the bucket, ping, and other factors, it will inevitably end up putting all the stacks together and then just end up filling up the lobby with solo players of varying ranks. This means that the stacks have a massive uncalculable advantage, and the solo players more or less act as cannon fodder. We've seen it since the game came out, with pros, streamers, master, pattern stacks running down entire lobbies of casual dads with a family of 5 who just got off their night shift at the oil rig for a quick game of Apex. This also means that by stacking as the worst player, you will avoid the ranked system giving you bad teammates, and as such, will get overall better teammates to help carry you to victory, instead of being doomed from the get-go. So being in a premade stack can certainly be a massive advantage, no matter whether you put in a lot or very little effort, especially around the peaks of the matchmaking, as the matchmaker can only pull players from below and never from above, because obviously there's nobody better than them to begin with. But let's talk more about the solo queue experience, because you guys' experiences keep getting swept under the rug. Thankfully, Sammy and the matchmaking team addressed some common complaints and actually indirectly quoted some of the experiments that I mentioned at the very start of the video. Respawn says that they don't purposefully put you in harder matches to slow you down if you're winning a lot, and that they don't intentionally put you in easier matches because you're on a losing streak. They say that they try to put you into matches where you will have a fair chance of winning, and those matches are at your current skill level. And you see, that's because every game your skill rating will see adjustments. If you're getting good results, winning a lot of games, getting a top 5 placement or high kill death ratio or whatever they use to quantify your skill level, you will end up against harder opponents. They're not intentionally trying to slow you down, but they just keep adjusting your matches to fit your skill level. And side note, a lot of people have a problem with this because you can't actually notice yourself getting better. If you keep improving but you never see any new results, it's gonna feel bad. So if you win a lot of games against 5s, eventually you will be pitted up against the 9s, maybe even the whole new skill bucket. This can be perceived as you getting a high win streak and then getting punished by being pitted against predators, because it is. Really, it's a matter of perspective, whether you consider it balance in lobbies and just making sure it completely evolves, or seeing it as punishment. Both are true. For example, this graph here shows your skill rating adjusting every game, with the vertical being your rating and the horizontal being the amount of games. Now, this example is a bit drastic because this player's skill was initially measured as far below their actual skill level. The algorithm quickly adjusted and leveled out once their actual skill level was identified. And this can go both ways. If another player is on tilt or having a series of bad games, their skill rating will drop and it might end up in your game, despite being that much higher of a rank than you. Also, another quick side note. As we established earlier, I'm aware that your rank or level is not an indicator of your skill level or your skill rating in the system. It's just the easiest way for me, Ottr, the narrator, to explain the examples. Okay. In the same vein, they also added they don't try to give good players bad teammates, which again is a matter of phrasing. They don't give you bad teammates purposefully, but if you're the best player on your team, such as a 9 in the previous example, you are bound to get worse players on your team. It also doesn't help that if you're on the top of the skill distribution, it is just hard to find other players that are as good as you, queuing at the same time, the same servers, ping, etc, etc. And to make matters worse for the matchmaker, most high skill players are simply already match-made together. And if all the high skill players are in groups, they can't end up on your team, meaning that you will end up being cannon fodder even as a high level player yourself. For example, this graph gives us some very valuable data, showing the frequency of diamond or higher players in pre-made squads, where only 32.6% of the diamond plus players are solo, and almost 70% of all diamond and above players are in a pre-made stack. Now, I'd argue that setting the bar so low and starting the count at diamond doesn't paint the whole picture. I would imagine it's a lot harder in master, but only Respawn has that data, and they chose not to include it for their own reason. So I did what any YouTuber might do. I actually reached out to Sammy himself, the author of the blog post, for more information about the stack percentage, and while he couldn't give me the exact number for every rank, he said that the difference from master and non-master teams is drastically different, to the point where, in his own words, you're not gonna hit master or predator as a solo. Now obviously Shiv did, but that's Shiv. And to me this is huge. It confirms what we've all kind of known by now. Stacking breaks matchmaking. A vast majority of Diamond Plus teams are pre-made stacks because it's your best chance of winning. The matchmaking can't do all this weird stuff if you make the team yourself. Respawn also addressed the phrase Big Brother matchmaking head on, like literally they called it by name here. Sammy says that it is a product of the matchmaking and it sadly will be unavoidable. But they are going to make efforts in fixing that in the new SBMM system, but more on that later. Because it also addressed the EOMM theory, stating that the matchmaking is not built to directly optimize retention and engagement. They explained that instead of optimizing for engagement and retention, they want to optimize for fun. But the kicker, there's actually no way to calculate how much fun a player is having. And players who have fun should be the ones playing for longer, so they choose to optimize after retention anyways. But thankfully, things are going to change. As we know, they are scrapping SBMM as we know it, and with 2023, Sammy happily announced that they are working on a new system that aims to compensate for the advantage from being in a full stack, and that they've been secretly testing the system on some servers over the course of the last few months. The following changes will roll out throughout the year. Instead of just having 4 skill buckets, they will have many more buckets. This will make the matchmaking a lot more precise. With these new buckets and higher matchmaker precision, Respawn needs to remake how the matchmaking system works, because higher precision will mean longer queue time, which is something they want to avoid. They solve this by flipping the search around, where instead of the old system, where they place players into static skill buckets, and then creating a match once it fills up with 60 players, it instead predicts the distribution of the skill of the incoming players, and it will dynamically choose the optimal trade-off between skill difference and wait time. This will be a smart solution, and we don't have the exact numbers, but as we understand, the so-called optimal trade-off will be the one with the highest player retention. This graph shows the current tests, with the y-axis being wait time and the x-axis being the time of day, with every colored graph being the max waiting time for that skill group. This new system aims to balance the queue times and the skill groups more efficiently, as you can see with the decreased queue time. They will continuously keep testing and rolling these changes out per region, and we've seen it take noticeable effect in some regions already. As for me, Ottr, yo, what's up? I'm back, the content creator who made this video, and you probably haven't subscribed to by now. I really feel vindicated. I've been talking about this for God knows how long, shouting it from the rooftops for years, taking so much backlash from the Apex community simply for telling the truth. Stacking gives you a massive advantage, to the point where a vast majority of higher skill players choose to be in a stack and solo players are left to rot. I'm so glad that the truth came out, and I really hope that Respawn's efforts to minimize the advantage from being in a pre-made team versus solos will pay off. But honestly, it will be really hard, and maybe they should just completely separate the stacks and the solos. Maybe just make rank solo queue past a certain rank and call it a day. Who knows? Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all tomorrow.